We are taught from a young age that the monsters are on the screen, that the shadows in the corner of the room vanish when we flip the switch. We find a strange comfort in the final girl of a horror movie, the one who survives the masked killer. But what happens when the final girl is the one holding the blade? What happens when a daughter decides that her mother isn't a protector, but a prop in a meticulously planned sequel? St. Clair, Sydney. A quiet night shattered, not by a scream, but by a knock on a neighbor's door. There stood Jessica, disheveled, calm, and holding a heavy, wet bundle. "I think I've killed my mother," she whispered. But she didn't just kill her. She had directed a masterpiece of carnage that even Hollywood would fear to film. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the monster, one must first look at the nursery. In the sun-drenched suburbs of Western Sydney, the Camilleri household appeared, by all accounts, to be a portrait of domestic endurance. Rita Camilleri was a woman of infinite patience, the kind of mother whose entire identity had been swallowed by the role of caretaker. And at the center of her world was Jessica. From the very beginning, Jessica was different. She didn't move through the world with the fluid social grace of her peers. Early on, she was diagnosed with a range of intellectual disabilities and autism spectrum disorder. To the outside world, she was a vulnerable young woman, fragile, perhaps a bit temperamental, but ultimately harmless. But behind the closed doors of their home, a much darker tapestry was being woven. As Jessica grew, her world began to shrink. The complexities of human interaction, the subtle cues of friendship, the nuances of empathy, remained locked boxes she couldn't open. So, she turned to a world she could control. A world where the rules were simple, even if they were soaked in blood. She found solace in the flickering blue light of the television. It started with a fascination that many teenagers share, a love for the macabre, the thrill of the jump scare. But for Jessica, it wasn't a hobby. It was a primary language. While other girls her age were dreaming of careers or romances, Jessica was building a shrine to the titans of the slasher genre. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Saw, Jeepers Creepers. These weren't just movies to her. They were instructional manuals. She became a connoisseur of the kill. She would sit for hours, rewinding the same scenes, her eyes reflected in the screen as she watched limbs being severed and lives being extinguished. She didn't just watch the gore, she studied it. She learned the sound a blade makes when it meets resistance. She learned the specific, rhythmic spray of an artery. To Jessica, there was a profound, twisted beauty in the total control a killer had over their victim. In the world of horror, the weak were silenced, and the powerful, the ones with the masks and the chainsaws, were the only ones who truly mattered. Rita watched this obsession grow with a mixture of concern and a desperate hope that it was just her way of coping. She bought the DVDs. She listened to Jessica recount the plots. She didn't realize she was fueling a fire that would eventually consume her. By her early 20s, Jessica's behavior began to take on a more sinister edge. The fragile daughter was developing a hair-trigger temper. She didn't just get angry, she became a force of nature. There were the phone calls, hundreds of them. Jessica would obsessively call strangers or acquaintances who had slighted her, screaming obscenities, threatening to cut off their heads. It was a specific recurring threat, a cinematic threat. The community saw a troubled girl. The medical professionals saw a complex case of behavioral issues linked to her neurodiversity. But no one truly saw the way Jessica was beginning to merge her reality with the scripts she memorized. She started to see herself as a protagonist in a world of villains. And in her mind, the person who exerted the most control over her, the person who tried to set boundaries, who tried to medicate her, who tried to keep her grounded in a reality she loathed, was her mother. Rita was the anchor. But to a woman who wanted to drift into a sea of red, an anchor is just a weight. Jessica's room became a fortress of plastic cases and posters of masked men. She had a collection, not of jewelry or shoes, but of horror films, over 500 of them. She would watch them on a loop, the dialogue sinking into her subconscious until she started to speak in the cadence of a movie villain. The social isolation was near total. She had no job, no real-world friends, no life outside the four walls of the house and the digital landscapes of cinematic slaughter. She began to demand more from Rita, more attention, more compliance. If a DVD didn't work, or if the internet was slow, the rage was volcanic. She would tear at her own hair, scream until her throat was raw, and directed that venom straight at the woman who had sacrificed everything for her. There is a specific kind of horror in the realization that your child is no longer yours. Rita lived in a state of perpetual high alert, a caregiver's fatigue that bordered on a survival instinct. She was walking on eggshells in a house filled with broken glass. She took Jessica to doctors. She sought help. But how do you explain to a psychiatrist that your daughter doesn't just like horror movies? She's starting to look at you like you're the first victim in an opening scene. The transformation was subtle, then sudden. The mask of care that the world saw, the image of a struggling disabled woman, was the perfect camouflage. No one suspects the girl who struggles to tie her shoes of being a calculated butcher. But inside, Jessica was waiting for her day X. She was waiting for the moment the credits would roll on her life as a submissive daughter and start on her life as a legend. The small details began to accumulate. The way she would linger in the kitchen, staring at the knife block. The way she would ask Rita questions about what happened to the body after death. The way she would mimic the cold, dead-eyed stare of Michael Myers in the hallway mirror. The domestic warmth of the Camilleri home was being replaced by an icy, calculated tension. The ordinary woman was gone. In her place was a woman who had spent years rehearsing for a role that was about to become terrifyingly real. The script was written. The cast was set. All Jessica needed was a spark to light the fuse. The bond between a mother and daughter is often described as a tether, unbreakable and profound. But for Rita and Jessica Camilleri, that tether had become a noose. By 2019, the dynamics within their home in St. Clair had devolved into a psychological pressure cooker. To understand why the cracks finally shattered the foundation of their lives, one must look at the exhausting circular nature of their relationship. Rita was not just a mother, she was a full-time guardian, a buffer between Jessica and a world that terrified and frustrated her. Rita's life was a series of negotiations. She negotiated Jessica's tantrums, her hygiene, her medications, and, increasingly, her escalating threats. Neighbors and extended family saw a woman who was perpetually tired, her face etched with the weariness of someone who had spent 25 years managing a storm that never broke. Jessica, meanwhile, existed in a state of arrested development, trapped between the cognitive abilities of a child and the physical strength of a woman. She possessed a deep-seated resentment toward her mother's authority. In Jessica's mind, Rita wasn't protecting her. Rita was a jailer. Every no, every reminder to take her pills, every attempt to curb her screen time was viewed as an act of war. The motive for what was to come wasn't born of a single moment of hate. It was a slow-growing cancer of entitlement and delusion. Jessica began to harbor a specific, toxic grievance. She believed her mother was evil. She convinced herself that Rita was controlling her through medicine and bullying her by demanding she live in reality. To a mind fueled by the logic of horror movies, the solution to a villain is simple. The villain must be eliminated. There was also the element of the Black Widow calculation, though not for financial gain. Jessica's calculation was emotional. She wanted total autonomy, the kind of freedom she saw in her favorite films, where the protagonist is answerable to no one. She began to talk about killing more frequently. It wasn't just "I hate you" anymore. It was "I'm going to cut your head off." Rita, perhaps blinded by a mother's hope, or perhaps simply paralyzed by fear, didn't flee. She did what many mothers of high-needs children do. She doubled down. She tried to love the violence out of Jessica. She even went so far as to pay a medium or exorcist thousands of dollars to rid Jessica of the demons she believed were possessing her. It was a desperate, final attempt to find a supernatural solution to a very human, very dangerous psychiatric problem. The cracks became chasms in the weeks leading up to July. Jessica's obsession with her horror collection reached a fever pitch. She wasn't just watching the movies. She was rehearsing them. She would stand in the kitchen, handling the knives, testing their weight. She would ask her sister, Christy, unsettling questions about whether you could live if your head was detached. She was checking the mechanics of her plan against the reality of human anatomy. There was a chilling incident involving a pet, a bird, that hinted at the escalating bloodlust. There were reports of Jessica being aggressive toward strangers in the street, fueled by a sense of perceived slight. The ordinary woman was slipping away, replaced by a persona that was cold, clinical, and increasingly emboldened. The motive was also shaped by a perverse desire for fame, or at least a desire to be as iconic as the characters she admired. Jessica didn't want a quiet life. She wanted a life that felt like a movie. She wanted the power to shock, the power to be feared, and the power to command the narrative. She began to view her mother not as a person, but as the victim required for her own origin story. By mid-July, the tension in the house was a physical presence. The air was thick with unsaid threats. Rita was exhausted, reportedly telling friends she was scared of her daughter. A rare admission for a woman who had spent decades defending her. The motive was now fully formed, an explosive mix of maternal resentment, a delusional need for self-defense against a non-existent threat, and a pathological drive to see if she could actually execute the gore she had watched 500 times on her bedroom wall. She began to wait for the right moment. Not an impulse, but a selection. She waited for a night when the world was quiet, when the neighbors were tucked away, and when the only sound in the house was the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. She was no longer just Jessica. She was the director, the star, and the executioner. The Black Widow was ready to bite, not for silk or gold, but for the visceral thrill of the kill. The plan was born from the Saw franchise, a game of life and death. Except Rita didn't know she was playing. She thought she was just making dinner. She thought she was safe in her home. She didn't realize that the girl she had tucked in for 25 years was now looking at her and seeing only a special effect waiting to happen. July 20th, 2019. In the suburbs of St. Clair, the winter air was crisp, and the streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows across the pavement of Richmond Crescent. Inside the Camilleri household, the atmosphere was thick, not with warmth, but with a suffocating electrical tension. This was the day the screen went black and the movie began. The evening started with a mundane domestic friction, the kind of trivial spark that, in any other house, would lead to a slammed door or a period of icy silence. But in Jessica's mind, the script had already been written. An argument broke out over something inconsequential. Reports suggest Rita had threatened to take Jessica to a psychiatric hospital, or perhaps she had simply reached her limit with Jessica's escalating verbal abuse. Whatever the trigger, the mask of care finally slipped from Jessica's face, revealing the cold, sharpened steel beneath. The kitchen, a place of nourishment and maternal care, became the kill floor. Jessica didn't reach for a single weapon. She reached for the tools of a trade she had studied for thousands of hours. She grabbed a knife, then another, and then another. As the first blade sunk into Rita's flesh, the reality of the act didn't horror Jessica. It seemed to energize her. The slasher wasn't a character anymore. It was her reflection in the stainless steel. What followed was not a quick struggle. It was a prolonged, ritualistic slaughter. Rita Camilleri, 57 years old, fought for her life against her own flesh and blood. She fought with the desperation of a mother who couldn't believe this was her end. But Jessica was relentless. She didn't just stab, she butchered. Over 100 stab wounds were later recorded. The sheer physical effort required for such an onslaught is staggering. The resistance of bone, the slickness of blood, the exhaustion of the muscles. Yet Jessica didn't tire. She was fueled by a pathological adrenaline, a manic focus that saw her switching knives when one became too blunt or broke under the force of the attack. The sounds in the house were a cacophony of terror, the rhythmic thud of the struggle, the gasping breaths of a dying woman, and the metallic clink of blades hitting the floor. Jessica later described the scene with a chilling, cinematic detachment. She spoke of the struggle as if she were a critic reviewing a particularly visceral scene in a film. Then came the climax of her obsession. Taking inspiration from the franchises that occupied her every waking thought, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Jeepers Creepers, Jessica decided that the mere death of her mother wasn't enough. She needed a trophy. She needed the definitive money shot of a horror masterpiece. With a clinical coldness that defies human comprehension, Jessica used her blades to decapitate her mother. She didn't stop until the head was completely severed from the body. But the movie wasn't over. The third act required an audience. Bathed in her mother's blood, Jessica did something that separates a simple murderer from a true monster. She picked up Rita's head. She walked through the house, past the photos of them together, past the DVDs and the posters of fictional killers, and opened the front door. She stepped out into the cool Sydney night. Imagine the silence of that street, the distant hum of traffic on the M4 motorway, the occasional bark of a dog, and then the sight of Jessica Camilleri walking down her driveway, carrying her mother's head like a macabre prop. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked to the neighbor's house and knocked. When no one answered, she moved to another. She eventually placed the head on the footpath, just outside a neighbor's fence, a grisly gift for the world to see. It was the ultimate jump scare in a life she had turned into a living nightmare. When the neighbors finally looked out, they didn't see a girl in need of help. They saw a figure standing in the shadows, covered in gore, gesturing toward a bundle on the ground. One neighbor would later testify to the sheer, surreal horror of realizing that the object on the concrete was not a mannequin or a sick joke, but the head of the woman who lived next door. Jessica's behavior in these minutes was characterized by a terrifying, lucid detachment. She wasn't screaming in grief. She wasn't in a state of catatonic shock. She was talking. She was explaining. When the first police officers arrived on the scene, they found her standing there, remarkably calm, given the carnage behind her. "I think I've killed my mother," she told them. But the phrasing was almost experimental, as if she were testing how the line sounded. The officers who entered the house were met with a scene that many would later require years of therapy to process. The kitchen was a sea of red. The ordinary items of a home, a kettle, a toaster, a fruit bowl, were splattered with the evidence of a frenzied execution. The sheer volume of blood was a testament to the ferocity of the attack. They found the broken knives, they found the body, and they found the daughter, who was now asking for her medicine and wondering if the doctors could sew her mother's head back on. This wasn't a crime of passion in the traditional sense. It was a crime of production. Jessica had spent years consuming images of the impossible, and on this night, she had finally brought them into the three-dimensional world. The sensory details, the metallic smell of the blood, the silence of the neighborhood, the weight of the trophy in her hands, were the final pieces of a puzzle she had been building since childhood. The Day X ended not with a dramatic escape, but with the click of handcuffs and the flashing blue and red lights of the New South Wales police force. As she was led away, Jessica didn't look back at the house. She didn't look at the bundle on the sidewalk. She looked forward, into the cameras, into the flashbulbs, finally the center of a story that the whole world would be forced to watch. The final girl had become the slasher, and the credits were only just beginning to roll on the most horrific legal case in Sydney's recent history. The immediate aftermath of the slaughter was not a scene of frantic escape or desperate concealment. Instead, it was a display of chilling, surreal transparency. Jessica Camilleri did not wash the blood from her skin. She did not change her blue floral dress, now heavy and darkened with the lifeblood of the woman who had loved her most. Instead, she stepped into the role of a witness to her own horror. She walked out of the house on Richmond Crescent, carrying her mother's head in one hand and 2 mobile phones in the other. In her mind, the transition from the action to the aftermath followed a logic known only to her, a logic where the severed head was not a tragedy, but evidence. The silence of the neighborhood was shattered when Jessica approached a neighbor's door. Imagine the perspective of that neighbor. A quiet Saturday night, the television flickering in the living room, perhaps a cup of tea on the side table. Then, a knock. You open the door to find a young woman from down the street, drenched from head to toe in deep, visceral crimson. She is calm, she is coherent, and she is telling you something that the human brain is not wired to process. "I think I've killed my mother," she says. When the neighbor, paralyzed by a mixture of shock and instinctual terror, didn't immediately respond, Jessica moved on. She walked to the footpath outside another house. It was here that she dropped the head. Not once, but twice. It rolled onto the concrete, a grotesque punctuation mark to the evening's events. Jessica stood over it, waiting. She wasn't fleeing the scene. She was waiting for the first responders to arrive and validate the movie she had just completed. When the 000 call was placed, the operator was met with a voice that didn't sound like a woman in the throes of a psychotic break. Jessica spoke with a hauntingly matter-of-fact tone. She handed the phone to a confused neighbor, then took it back to explain that it was a life-or-death situation. She claimed her mother had tried to stab her, and that in self-defense, she had fought back. She used the vocabulary of a victim, but the details she provided were purely from the perspective of a butcher. "I took off her head," she told the operator. "I had my mother's head in my hand. I know this sounds insane." The first police officer to arrive, Senior Constable Anthony D'Agostino, found himself in a waking nightmare. His body cam caught the flickering blue and red lights reflecting off Jessica's blood-matted hair. She was holding a bottle of water and a phone. She wasn't aggressive toward the officers. She was inquisitive. Her questions, captured on tape, reveal the total dissolution of the boundary between her cinematic obsessions and the permanence of death. "Can you bring someone back to life if they don't have a head?" she asked, her voice tilting with a childlike curiosity. "Can you bring her back to life? Can the doctors do a miracle and sew her head back on?" When the officer, likely struggling to maintain his professional composure, told her that was a bit of a stretch, Jessica's concern shifted instantly. It wasn't grief for Rita that occupied her mind. It was her own survival. "I won't get the death penalty or anything, will I?" This is where the mask of care was replaced by the mask of the ego. Throughout the interaction, Jessica's focus remained entirely on herself. She complained that she couldn't move her fingers properly because of the incident. She fretted about being able to wash the blood off in the shower. She seemed to view the decapitation of her mother as a strenuous chore she had been forced to complete, rather than an act of ultimate depravity. The neighbors watched from behind drawn curtains and from the edges of their driveways as the police tape went up. The quiet street was now a forensic laboratory. The head lay on the concrete, under the harsh glare of flashlights, while the body remained in the kitchen, a scene so macabre that several of the responding officers would later require intensive psychological counseling. In those first few hours of custody, Jessica's behavior remained consistent with her slow burn transformation. She wasn't a weeping daughter, she was a storyteller. She began to weave a narrative of giving her mother a taste of her own medicine. She spoke of the struggle, of how, half her nose fell off, and how she didn't think to put the head in a bag. She was looking for the replay button. She wanted to talk about the boom, boom, boom of the stabbing. She was, in her own mind, the star of a grisly new release, and the police were simply her first audience. The ordinary woman was gone for good. In the back of the police cruiser, as the lights of St. Clair faded behind her, Jessica Camilleri wasn't mourning. She was finally, terrifyingly, the center of attention. The detectives from the homicide squad were seasoned professionals, but the sheer clinical precision of the violence left them chilled. In the kitchen, they found a graveyard of kitchenware. 7 knives were recovered, many of them broken or bent, their handles slick with the evidence of Jessica's frantic exertion. But it was the discovery of Jessica's bedroom that provided the most damning exposure of her internal world. There, investigators found a sprawling library of the macabre. Over 500 DVDs were meticulously organized, a digital mausoleum of cinematic gore. They found posters and drawings that mirrored the very scene they had just processed in the kitchen. It became clear that this wasn't an explosion of rage. It was an imitation of art. Jessica hadn't just killed her mother. She had produced a scene from her favorite franchises. The exposure of her search history revealed a woman who had spent months researching human anatomy, focusing specifically on the neck and the difficulty of decapitation. When the formal police interviews began at the St. Mary's police station, the mask of the fragile daughter fell away entirely, replaced by a cold-blooded narrator. Jessica sat across from the detectives, her blue floral dress replaced by a gray forensic jumpsuit, and she began to talk. And talk. She didn't just confess, she critiqued her own performance. With a flat, monotone delivery that lacked any trace of maternal grief, she described the chore of the murder. She explained to the detectives how she had overkilled her mother because she wanted to make sure she was definitely gone. She spoke about the knives as if she were discussing a DIY project, complaining that some of them weren't sturdy enough for the task at hand. The detectives pushed her on the motive. She reverted to a script of self-defense, claiming that Rita had been the aggressor, but her story crumbled under the weight of her own pride. She couldn't help but brag about her strength. She told the officers with a hint of a smile that she had taken her head off. When asked why, she didn't offer a reason born of fear. She offered a reason born of a fanatical curiosity. She wanted to see if it would look like the movies. The investigation then turned to the cracks Rita had tried so hard to hide. Detectives spoke to family members and neighbors, uncovering a history of phantom calls and terrifying threats. They discovered that Jessica had made hundreds of anonymous phone calls to strangers, often using the same specific threat. "I'm going to cut your head off." It was a catchphrase she had been practicing for years. The most disturbing exposure, however, was the role of the medium. Investigators found that Rita had been so desperate, so terrified of the monster her daughter was becoming, that she had spent up to $2,500 on a woman who claimed she could perform an exorcism on Jessica. The tragedy was laid bare. Rita knew the danger was coming. She had felt the icy breath of the Black Widow on her neck for months, but instead of calling the police, she had called a mystic, hoping that love and faith could rewrite a script that was already being filmed. The forensic psychiatrists who entered the investigation faced a unique challenge. Jessica was clearly neurodivergent, but was she insane in the legal sense? The investigation revealed a woman who was acutely aware of the consequences. She had asked about the death penalty. She had asked if she could wash the blood off before the police arrived. She had even checked her own reflection in the mirror during the attack. This wasn't the behavior of someone who didn't know right from wrong. It was the behavior of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was simply checking the special effects. As the days passed, the overconfidence that Jessica had displayed on the night of the crime began to work against her. She assumed that her diagnosis would be a get-out-of-jail-free card. She believed that because she had been bullied by her mother's rules, the world would sympathize with her rebellion. But the evidence, the 100 stab wounds, the severed head, the trophy on the sidewalk, told a different story. It told the story of a woman who had chosen her obsession over her humanity. The investigation ended not with a mystery solved, but with a terrifying portrait of a horror movie obsessive who had finally stopped watching and started doing. The exposure was complete. The world now knew that in a quiet house in St. Clair, the girl who loved the Texas Chainsaw Massacre had finally found her own Leatherface, and it was her. The legal battle that followed the horrors of Richmond Crescent was not a question of who, but a clinical dissection of a fractured mind. When Jessica Camilleri appeared in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, the public expected to see a monster. Instead, they saw a woman who seemed almost bored by the proceedings, a woman whose primary concern appeared to be when she could go home and resume her life. The trial, which unfolded in late 2020, became a battlefield for forensic psychiatrists. The central question: was Jessica a cold-blooded murderer who had finally acted out a lifelong fantasy, or was she a victim of her own biological wiring? The prosecution laid out a case of calculated ferocity. They pointed to the sheer logistics of the crime, the selection of multiple knives, the physical endurance required to decapitate a human being, and the deliberate act of carrying the head outside to show the neighbors. This wasn't a snap of the mind, they argued. It was a performance. They presented her obsession with horror films not as a passive hobby, but as a blueprint. Jessica's defense team painted a different portrait. They leaned heavily on her diagnoses: autism spectrum disorder, an intellectual disability, and a history of intermittent explosive disorder. They argued that Jessica didn't have the specific intent to murder, but rather had suffered a catastrophic meltdown fueled by a social and cognitive inability to process frustration. The jury was shown the police interview tapes. The courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as Jessica's voice filled the room, describing the struggle with the detachment of a person describing a trip to the grocery store. "I gave her a taste of her own medicine," she was heard saying. The lack of remorse was a physical presence in the room. There were no tears for Rita. There was only a persistent, nagging focus on her own discomfort and the annoyance of her mother's resistance. In December 2020, the jury reached a verdict that reflected the complexity of the case. They found Jessica not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter by way of substantial impairment. It was a special verdict, a recognition that while she knew what she was doing was wrong, her capacity to control herself was fundamentally broken. The sentencing hearing in 2021 was the final act of this tragedy. Justice Helen Wilson did not mince words. She described the crime as extraordinarily serious and a matter of great public horror. She spoke of the unimaginable terror Rita must have felt in her final moments, at the hands of the child she had spent her life protecting. Under the laws of New South Wales, Jessica was sentenced to a maximum of 21 years and 7 months in prison, with a non-parole period of 16 years and 2 months. But the climax didn't end with the banging of the gavel. In 2024, the case returned to the headlines as detention reviews and appeals regarding her mental health treatment within the correctional system were scrutinized. Even behind bars, Jessica remained a figure of intense debate. Was she a patient to be cured or a predator to be contained? Throughout the trial, Jessica's demeanor never shifted. She didn't look at her sister, Christy, who sat in the gallery, her life shattered. She didn't look at the photos of the mother she had butchered. She sat in the dock, sometimes fidgeting, sometimes staring into space, as if she were waiting for the boring parts of the movie to end so she could get to the credits. The truth that emerged in court was perhaps the most frightening of all. Jessica Camilleri wasn't insane, in the way we like to imagine. She wasn't seeing demons or hearing voices from the beyond. She was simply a woman who had allowed the boundary between the fake blood of the screen and the real blood of the kitchen to vanish. She had become the star of her own slasher film, and the Australian legal system was left to pick up the pieces of a script that should never have been written. The screen eventually fades to black, but for those who lived through the nightmare of Richmond Crescent, there is no "the end" credit. Jessica Camilleri remains behind the high walls of a correctional center, a woman whose name has become synonymous with the ultimate betrayal of the maternal bond. In the years since her sentencing, including the 2024 reviews of her mental state, the case serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of the ordinary. We like to believe that evil is a distant shadow, something that belongs in the flickering world of a 90-minute movie. We tell ourselves that monsters are masked figures in the woods, not the daughters we feed, clothe, and protect. But the story of Jessica and Rita proves that the most terrifying horror isn't found in a fictional script. It's found in the silence of a suburban kitchen when the empathy of a human soul finally flickers out. Rita Camilleri died trying to save a daughter who had already replaced her with a character in a slasher film. Today, the house in St. Clair stands as a silent witness to the night the masks fell. It reminds us that while still waters run deep, sometimes what lies beneath the surface isn't just mystery, it's a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. In the end, Jessica got the iconic status she craved, but it came at the cost of the only person who truly saw her as human. The credits have rolled, the theater is empty, but the echoes of that July night continue to scream. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below.